Welcome back to another episode of Advanced RC Adventures. A2RC here. This is a channel where we investigate, explore, build and explain, upgrade and advance Nitro RCs to another level. Come start a new adventure with me. Today we're going to go over a pretty special little engine. It's possible some of you have not seen or seen this for a very long time. This is from the manufacturer Enya, E-N-Y-A. And this is a retrofit from its airplane engine sister. These were made in Japan, but this is a car-specific designed engine. They changed a lot of the different features from the airplane model to the car model. And we're going to go through this and talk about why this is a pretty special thing. So in around the mid-1970s, there was a 12th scale and 10th scale car class that was created. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that while we open this up a bit. Like all of our disassembly steps, we have our carburetor here. We're going to take that off first, go through the back plate and look at the internals, take off the head, have a little explanation, and go from there. So a lot of these older style engines use these carburetor bolts that held down the carburetor itself. You saw that with HPI, you saw that with OS. And talking about OS, so OS had their small airplane engines as well. And a part of why this engine is unique is that the class that was created for these style engines were 0.11 cubic inch or a 1.8 cc class. And why that's special is it's a relatively small car engine, especially when you talk about today. So I'm not sure if you can pick it up on camera. The carb itself is nice and shiny aluminum, but there's an Enya, E-N-Y-A, engraved into it. We've got a rotary carb, nice aluminum handle. This is a 2-needle carb. So we have our high speed here, and we have our low speed here. So back in 1981 is when this car version was released. That's a big deal. There are older engines, or I should say younger, I guess, engines that only have single needle carbs. Notice all of the chromed metal features. We of course have our dust boot for the carb, but all the traditional kinds of things that you would expect. Idle, speed, there's an O-ring or a black butyl seal there down on the bottom, but you make your high speed adjustments here and your low speed there. So this 1.8 cc class, it was developed I think around 1979, 1980, and OS converted their engines already for this car class, but Enya wanted to do the same, and so they developed this car version of the LCX. So these originally came with black oxide bolts, but I've already upgraded these to some stainless steel versions. You're going to see in a portion of the video the bearings being replaced into the block. We have a ceramic front and we have a chrome steel bearing in the rear. And the reason why I went with that is I would have put both chrome steel versions in here, but I was able to find this ceramic bearing for about the same price as the chrome steel, so why not make a big upgrade, at least on one of the bearings, and make it ceramic. Here we have our Enya 11CX aluminum block. This is model 2201. We have some new bearings for them. Front bearing is an 8 by 16 by 5 On this particular build, we're going to be using a ceramic. That's because that's what I was able to find in that size. And then the rear is a 10 by 19 by 5. And that's going to be a chrome steel, chrome cage bearing. So let's open up the pack. We're going to take off one seal on the front bearing. We're going to take off both seals on the back. The best way of doing this is whatever you feel most comfortable with, but I use generally a razor blade, and you just pick up the edge of the seal. Some spots are a little bit easier than others. The outside portion is normally the easiest area, but whatever you feel most confident in. So there's one side. On the rear, you want to take off both shields so that it can be lubricated properly. On the front, take off the rear shield, or the shield that is going to be facing the internal portion of the engine, and leave the outside one on. And that's just for a dust cover. It doesn't actually help seal the engine, it's just a dust shield. And so you can leave one of them on. Let's pick this shield out here on the ceramic bearing. So this particular one uses a different style cage. I'm actually going to put this side shield back in, and we're going to pick out the other side. So it's important to use something like a razor blade like this so that you do not damage the shield, so you can put it back in if need be. But the reason why I'm doing this is you'll see in a second. So on this side, you have the open ball. You can see the balls. There's a little bit of a lubricant inside of there. We're going to leave that alone. But that's the side that the shield is missing now. It's going to face the interior of the engine. So what I prefer to do, if possible, place your bearing on your crankshaft or something so you can easily insert it onto the block. So you'll use this as kind of like a tool, so you can insert that into the block. There's a number of different ways to put in your bearings. I prefer heat. It's the quickest, simplest, in my opinion, safest way. Every time you use a bearing pooler, it's fine that they're designed for a bearing pooler, but you can remove little bits of material on the case. And when you use heat, what will happen is that the portion where the bearings go in, they expand. And then you put the bearing in, and then it contracts as it cools. And that helps to provide a compression fit, a snug fit on the rear and the front. And you can use an oven or toaster oven or something of that nature, but it takes a long time, and you generally have to take it in and out, where if you use a little bit of propane, you can heat up your bearing surfaces, placing your bearing in no time at all. So in my experience, you can chill your crank and bearing if you want to in the freezer for a little while, and it may or may not help. It may be a good redundant step to do just to help. But what I've found over the years is that as long as you get your block nice and hot, you don't necessarily have to chill your bearings if you don't want to. Every experience might be a little bit different. You go ahead and try out for yourself and do what you feel is best for your situation. So we're going to warm up. We're going to warm up this front section first with a little bit of propane. and we're going to work on putting in that front bearing first. You just move your heat around. I try to leave the heat on a little bit lower setting. Of course, it's still getting it nice and hot, of course, but it's not going to be such an extreme amount of heat. It gives you a little bit of extra time to work the heat around, and then you can put your bearing in. So now that your bearing's in, make sure you use some very good heat resistant gloves. I'm just pushing the bearing in for a second, and then I'm taking it out. You can let that cool. It's all the way in. And that dust shield is nice and clean, sitting up front. And then we're going to heat this area right around here for that rear bearing. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to put our bearing, we're going to put it on the crankshaft. We're again going to use this as a pseudo tool. Okay, so now that we have our bearing ready on the shaft, we're going to go ahead and warm up this, we'll call it the center section of the block. And then we'll take the shaft and bearing and we'll put it through the back. Just moving the heat around again. Just trying to warm up that section of block where the bearing's going to go. We don't need to concentrate the heat anywhere else. Drop our shaft and bearing down inside. Let that cool. You can leave the bearings and the shaft in there. Just let all that cool together. And then once it's all done cooling, go back to room temperature. Then you can go ahead and continue to assemble your engine. So we'll take off this back plate here. These are M2.5 bolts. Very similar to a lot of the other small block style engines. So OS and a lot of other companies made, you might recall, for example, like an OS CV or a 12 CV or 12 CVR. Well, that is 12 or 0.12 cubic inches. This is a 0.11. So, though it's about the same size, it's unique in the sense that it's relatively small displacement. So we have our back plate here. This uses a paper style gasket, very similar to what the OS CV engines used. Set that to the side. Take a look here in the back. Another very unique feature is, if you recall, let's put our mindset back to the Toki built HPI 12E and the 15FE. They used a brass rod. This uses a billet aluminum rod with brass bushings. And there's another surprise inside that later on in years, when engine manufacturers decide to do this a little bit more often, it's mainly on high performance top end engines. Let's take off the head. The head uses nice and big M3 bolts. So this head was specially designed by Enya's engineers and designers. It's not an airplane head. It's specifically designed for cars, so it's a little bit taller and a little bit bigger in diameter than the airplane heads might be. And this was made specifically for that 1.8 cc car class. We have an integrated compression bubble here. It uses a standard glow plug. Something that I had to do a little research and find out, these particular engines do not use head shims. This is an aluminum head, and as you know that some of the head shims are made out of aluminum these days. But what they've done is they've machined the shim directly into the head. And so if you ever needed or wanted to change the shim, you're going to have to replace the whole head itself. Or potentially, if you have the know-how or have a machine shop, maybe you might be able to turn that down and make shims or put shims on from today's engines. But that's something relatively unique. Let's pop out this sleeve. So this engine has been ran before, but only, as I understand it, one break-in tank. So this thing is effectively new. But let's take a look here. This uses an AAC construction. Not an ABC, not an ABN construction, an AAC. And that's something that's very uncommon, very unique to model glow engines of any time period. So ABC engines uses aluminum, brass, chrome. We have an aluminum piston. Let's take a look. These are captured wrist pin. There's some spring clips in there. You have the piston skirt itself is relatively full around except for some timing cutouts and this aluminum rod. This is an aluminum sleeve, but it is chrome lined, and that's something that's pretty darn unique. The other thing is we have, so let's take a look at our ports. We have our exhaust port. This is a 3-port engine. We have our boost port here, relatively small, but if we can capture this on camera, we've got a big cutout or milling done on the side transfer ports and the boost port. So that helps to direct that airflow directly into that intake boost port. And then the side transfer ports, the same thing. We have that cutout going directly into a pretty big side transfer port, and on the same side. But the entire interior of the sleeve is chrome lined. Take a look at that bottom. Notice those cutouts. So if you watched an earlier episode on the Kyosho GX15 engine, there was no milling down inside of the block. Well, this actually has a lot of milling for the boost port and for the transfer ports, and so that's something unique as well. They removed the material here on the sleeve, but then they also removed the port timing material and flow material out of the block as well. So definitely a fun, unique engine from over 40 years ago. This was released. All aluminum, a very unique chrome lined aluminum sleeve, a big beefy aluminum rod. And from all of this, you would think, oh, maybe we're going to get some decent horsepower numbers. Well, technology was very different. and this particular engine created 0.4 horsepower, which is not a great deal. Now it's still in line with some of the 0.12 engines. For example, the 12E from HPI Toki built was 0.4, 0.5. So it's right in that same ballpark. So it's a pretty unique, very vintage engine, and we're going to find an exhaust to bolt up on here and rebuild this and put this on the test stand and give it a little whirl. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. If you like anything 10 scale, nitro, and especially touring cars, then this is a place to be. So thanks for taking the adventure with me.